Joining me now is Dr. Anthony Fauci, White House COVID Task Force member and director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Dr. Fauci, thanks for being with us tonight. We've had a long day. You've been saying that we can't go back to normal at times until there's a vaccine or some type of massive change to this whole thing. But how is the president's plan to reopen parts of the economy and the country in line with that?
Well, it is, because as you know, it's been in detail described, but it is a gradual process. It takes into account that we have a heterogeneous dynamics of outbreaks throughout the country. As you mentioned, California is really different than New Orleans, is really different than New York or Detroit, and places like Arkansas and New Mexico are very different. So what this plan does, it creates a baseline of a starting point, which we call the gating, where you have to have a certain degree of indication that the outbreak is decreasing over a period of time. And then you graduate gradually from one phase to another phase to another phase, which will allow those areas that really have had very little involvement to more rapidly and effectively get back to a more normal approach. Whereas others, which are still struggling, they would have to get past the first, I would say, requirement of being able to get into the phases. So I had said with you, Laura, some time ago on the show, that if we go back to normal, it's not going to be like a light switch going on and off. It's going to be a gradual progressive that's going to be dictated by the situation in a particular region of the country.
Right.
This addresses that very clearly. And
Dr. Fauci, that gives maximum flexibility to the states, no doubt. But Speaker Nancy Pelosi, of course, from California, calls this plan of yours and the president's vague and inconsistent. And this is what Joe Biden said about it just moments ago. Watch.
I wouldn't call it a plan. I think what he's done, he's kind of punted. He's decided that he doesn't have the right to make the call for the country. This isn't going to be over till we have a vaccine.
Punted, you punted, all of you people working on this, and apparently he's claiming that you didn't listen to yourself since you are a scientist.
I don't know what you mean. I didn't listen to myself.
Well, he said they're not listening to the scientists. They're punting, and basically it's not over until there's a vaccine. So your response to Biden?
Well, there's truth to that. It's not going to be over to the point of our being able to not do any mitigation until we have a scientifically sound, safe, and effective vaccine. But that does not mean that we can't approach a significant degree of normality. One of the things that we said very clearly, that throughout all of those phases, there's a baseline level of care that we would have to be addressing that we didn't have before we had this outbreak. So whether you're on phase 1 and still tightened up a bit, or you've already graduated to phase 3, there are still guidelines for all phases. That's what we feel is going to be safeguarding any explosion, which we hope will never happen. And if it does, one of the requirements of this is to make sure we have the capability of jumping all over that. So I don't think there's any inconsistencies there.
But Dr. Fauci, on the question of a vaccine, we don't have a vaccine for SARS. I mean, they got close in mice. We don't have a vaccine for HIV, and life did go on, right? So the idea that we're definitely going to have a vaccine, we didn't really approach much else in the same way as we're pegging going back to normal with a vaccine, did we?
Well, no, but Laura, this is different. HIV/AIDS is entirely different. We don't have a vaccine for HIV/AIDS, but we have spectacularly effective treatment. People who invariably would have died years ago right now are leading essentially normal lives. SARS is a different story. SARS disappeared. We developed a vaccine. We were in the process of going through the various phases. We showed it was safe. We showed it induced a good response. And then SARS disappeared. And we didn't need to develop a vaccine for SARS. So I think it's a little bit misleading maybe to compare what we're going through now with HIV or SARS. They're really different.
But we don't know. This could disappear. I mean, SARS did pretty much disappear. This could as well, correct?
Yeah. Anything could, Laura, but I have to tell you, the degree of efficiency of transmissibility of this is really unprecedented in anything that I've seen. It's an extraordinarily efficient virus in transmitting from one person to another. Those
Dr.
kind
Fauci,
of viruses don't just disappear.
Okay, well, I just want to talk about California, because no one's really been able to explain that, the differential between a state with 40 million people and 951 deaths and New Jersey and New York or Louisiana or Illinois. The numbers they don't really make sense. Right. And even with the shutdown dates, it's a few days off here or there. Could there be different viral strains that circulated longer on the West Coast versus predominantly on the East Coast, the clades, Dr. Fauci? Have you looked into that?
Well, there could be, but they're not. If you look at the sequences of the viruses that are now going into the genetic banks, I mean, obviously, RNA viruses mutate a lot. There's no indication whatsoever that it has any functional relevance. But there are good epidemiological possibilities of why there's such a difference. Remember, the first cases, Laura, that came into the country from Wuhan and the people that we brought in when we were bringing them back who are American citizens, that seeded in Washington State and in some regions of California in the LA area. That was at a time when there were so few cases that the people in Washington and in California were able to do effective containment. So they never allowed it to get to the point of needing mitigation. New York City, they really got caught by surprise, because if you look at the seeding into New York City, that was mostly from Europe. That wasn't from China. And by the time they realized they had a problem in a big city with a big subway system, there was a problem. I mean, it started off in New Rochelle, remember, with a single case, came down into the city, and then we had a problem. So through no fault of their own, New York City got hit really hard, where fortunately California and Washington started off with a very small stimulus, which they jumped all over.
Dr. Fauci, we asked viewers to submit their questions about the president's reopening plan, and this question comes from Kate. She said, how does phase one include ramping up the workforce without schools and daycares opening? Schools don't open until phase two, but 85% of American parents work outside the home. Schools are the primary form of childcare for most of us American parents. Dr. Fauci, how would you answer that?
Yeah. Well, there isn't a perfect answer to that. Obviously, that is an issue that remember, the schools that are closed stay closed. That doesn't mean that you will close schools that are open, depending upon where you are. So I don't see in phase one all schools being closed. If you look at the words carefully, it says those that were already closed, make sure you get through phase one before you pull back. But if someone, a governor in a state or whatever, is thinking about what they need to do, and their state is doing pretty well, they don't necessarily have to close the schools.
And Dr. Fauci, finally, do we have all the data that we want from China? I know you have a good working relationship with Chinese scientists and academics, but what about that primary data about patient zero and all that key data about the therapies that they've used?
No, I mean, I think any of us who have been dealing with this now for the last few months don't feel confident at all that we have all of the data of the originally infected individuals, how long there were people in the circulation, or even now, how many deaths there really are in China. That number is really rather a low number. That number surprises me, that number is so low. But then again, it is what it is. It's behind us. Let's move ahead and address our own problem.
Dr. Fauci, we really appreciate you taking some time tonight. Thanks so much.
Always good to be with you, Laura. Thank you.
All right.